There are places on the water that don't appear on any official chart, places that fishermen whisper about in harbor bars but never visit twice. And sometimes, just sometimes, a father will keep such a place secret for 30 years, waiting for the right moment to show his son what he found there. Jonas Whitmore had been a fisherman for 41 years. His hands told that story better than any words could. Thick fingers scarred by hooks and lines, knuckles swollen from decades of hauling nets in freezing water, palms calloused so deep they felt like leather. He was 63 years old, and he had spent more of his life on the Atlantic than on dry land. His boat, the Northern Grace, was older than his marriage, older than his son, older than most of the men who still worked these waters. She was a 38-foot trawler with a diesel engine that coughed like an old man every morning, but never once failed to start. Jonas had bought her when he was 22, and he had loved her longer than he had loved anything else in his life, except, perhaps, for his boy. Daniel Whitmore was 34. He had left the island when he was 18, and he had spent 16 years trying to become something other than a fisherman's son. He had gone to college on the mainland, studied business, worn suits, sat in glass offices, and made money that would have seemed like fantasy to the men who worked the boats. But somewhere along the way, maybe in his late 20s, maybe after his divorce, maybe after the third promotion that felt like nothing, he had started dreaming about the water again. He would wake up in his Boston apartment and smell salt air that wasn't there. He would hear gulls in his sleep. He would catch himself staring at rivers and harbors and coastlines with a hunger he couldn't explain. And then, 3 months ago, his mother had called to tell him that his father was sick. How sick? Daniel had asked, gripping the phone too tight. His mother had paused. Sick enough that you should come home. He had come home. He had walked off the ferry onto Kettle Island for the first time in 6 years, and his father had been standing on the dock, thinner than Daniel remembered, grayer, smaller somehow, but with the same sharp blue eyes that had always seemed to see right through him. They had stood there for a long moment, father and son, not quite knowing how to bridge the distance that had grown between them. Then Jonas had nodded once, turned, and walked toward the truck. Daniel had followed. That was how it had always been between them. Words were scarce. Actions were everything. 3 months later, Daniel was still on the island. He told himself he was staying to help his mother. He told himself he was staying because his father needed someone to help with the boat. He told himself a lot of things. But the truth he whispered to himself in the dark hours of the morning, was that he was staying because he had finally realized that the life he had built on the mainland was empty, beautiful and successful, and utterly hollow. And whatever was left of his father's life, he wanted to be there for it. The diagnosis was lung cancer. Stage 3. The doctors on the mainland had given Jonas 12 to 18 months, but Jonas had just laughed at them, a dry, rasping sound that turned into a cough. "I've been listening to experts tell me what to do my whole life," he had said. "Fish here, not there. Sell now, not later. And I'm still standing." But Daniel had seen the way his father's hands shook when he thought no one was watching. He had seen the bottles of pain medication hidden in the bathroom cabinet. He had heard the coughing fits that came in the night, muffled behind closed doors. Time was running out. It was a Thursday morning in October when everything changed. Daniel woke early, as he had learned to do since coming home. The island ran on fisherman's time. Up before dawn, breakfast in the dark, boats on the water by first light. He pulled on jeans and a heavy sweater and walked down to the kitchen, expecting to find his mother already making coffee. But the kitchen was empty. Instead, his father was sitting at the old wooden table, alone, with a single lamp casting yellow light across the scarred surface. In front of him was something Daniel had never seen before. It was a map. Old, so old that the paper had turned the color of weak tea, so old that the edges were soft and frayed like fabric. It was hand-drawn, the lines faded but still visible, showing a stretch of coastline that Daniel vaguely recognized. There were depth markings and current arrows and small notations in handwriting that he knew was his father's, but younger somehow, the letters more certain, less weathered by time. And in the center of the map, marked with a simple X, was a location about 12 miles offshore, in a stretch of water that Daniel had never heard anyone mention. His father looked up. "Close the door." Daniel closed it. He sat down across from his father, his eyes fixed on the map. "What is this?" Jonas didn't answer right away. He reached out and touched the edge of the paper, almost tenderly, the way you might touch something precious and fragile. "I drew this when I was 26 years old," he said finally. 2 years before you were born. I've never shown it to anyone. Not your mother, not my crew, not a single soul in 40 years. Daniel felt something shift in his chest. "Why?" His father met his eyes. "Because I wasn't ready, and neither were you." He pushed the map across the table. "But I'm running out of time to be ready, and there are things I need to show you before I go." Daniel picked up the map. The X was positioned in open water, far from any of the usual fishing grounds. There were no landmarks nearby, no shoals or wrecks or anything that would normally draw a fisherman's attention. Just blue emptiness on the chart. Just the X circled 3 times in fading ink. "What's there?" Daniel asked. His father stood up slowly, painfully, bracing himself on the edge of the table. "Get your gear. We're going out." The morning was cold and gray, the sky the color of old iron. Daniel helped his father down to the dock where the Northern Grace was waiting, her hull slapping gently against the pilings in the rising tide. The harbor was quiet. Most of the other boats had already gone out, chasing the fish that were running good this time of year. But Jonas wasn't interested in fish today. He moved around the boat with the ease of long practice, checking lines and gauges and equipment, his hands steady now despite the sickness in his lungs. This was his place. This was where he had always been strongest. They motored out of the harbor as the first gray light broke over the eastern horizon. Daniel stood at the wheel while his father sat in the captain's chair beside him, the old map spread across his knees. The island fell away behind them, its familiar shape growing smaller, the lighthouse on the north point, the cluster of houses around the harbor, the dark mass of pines that covered the interior. Daniel knew every inch of that island. He had grown up there, learned to walk on its rocky beaches, learned to swim in its cold waters, learned to tie knots and read weather and gut fish before he learned to read books, and he had spent 16 years trying to forget it all. "Head northeast," his father said, 325 degrees. Daniel adjusted course. The boat settled into a steady rhythm, her diesel engine thrumming beneath their feet. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was old and deep, filled with all the things they had never said, the arguments and disappointments and distances that had accumulated over decades. Daniel had blamed his father for being distant, for loving the sea more than his family, for never saying the words that a son needed to hear. And Jonas had blamed Daniel for leaving, for chasing a life that seemed to reject everything Jonas had built and believed in. They had hurt each other in the quiet ways that family members do, and they had never learned how to stop. But now, on this gray October morning, something was different. Maybe it was the cancer. Maybe it was the map. Maybe it was just the fact that time was finally forcing them to stop running. Daniel glanced at his father, saw the way the old man was watching the horizon with those sharp blue eyes, and felt a sudden ache in his throat. "You know," Jonas said quietly, "I always thought I'd have more time. Time to fix things. Time to say what needed saying." He shook his head slowly. "Funny how you can spend your whole life out here, surrounded by all this space, and still feel like you're running out of room." Daniel didn't know what to say, so he just kept his hands on the wheel and his eyes on the compass. They traveled for nearly 2 hours. The island disappeared completely, swallowed by the gray distance. The water around them grew darker, deeper, the swells longer and heavier. They were in open ocean now, far from shore, far from any shipping lanes or fishing grounds. Daniel had been out here before, but always passing through, never stopping, never lingering. There was nothing out here. That was what everyone said, just water and sky and the endless rolling waves. "Here," Jonas said suddenly. "Cut the engine." Daniel throttled back. The northern grace slowed, her momentum carrying her forward for another 100 yards before she settled into a gentle drift. The silence was immense. No engine, no other boats, no sound but the wind and the water and the cry of a single gull somewhere in the gray sky. Jonas stood up slowly, gripping the rail for support. He moved to the side of the boat and looked down at the water, his face unreadable. Daniel joined him. The ocean here was dark blue, almost black, and so clear that he could see 20 feet down before the light faded into shadow. There was nothing visible beneath them. Just depth. Just emptiness. "What are we looking for?" Daniel asked. His father reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something Daniel hadn't seen in 30 years. An old brass compass, the one that had belonged to his grandfather, the one that Jonas had always kept locked in a box in his study. It was tarnished and dented, the glass cracked in one corner, but it was still beautiful in the way that old things can be. "Your grandfather gave me this compass when I was 16, Jonas said. "He told me it would always point me toward what mattered." He turned it over in his hands. "I didn't understand what he meant until I came out here." "What happened here?" Jonas was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Get the diving gear." The gear was old but serviceable. 2 sets of tanks and regulators, wetsuits, masks. Daniel hadn't been diving in years, not since college, but his father had insisted he learn when he was young. "A fisherman who can't go under the water is only seeing half the world," Jonas had said. Daniel had thought it was just another of his father's strange philosophies. Now he wondered if there had been more to it. They suited up in silence. Jonas moved slowly, his breathing labored, and Daniel wanted to tell him to stay on the boat, that whatever was down there, Daniel could find it alone. But he knew better than to say it. This was something his father needed to do himself. Some things couldn't be delegated. When they were ready, Jonas sat on the gunwale with his back to the water. He looked at Daniel with an expression that Daniel had never seen before. Something between fear and hope, and a deep, tired love. "What we're about to see," Jonas said, "I've only seen twice in my life. Once when I was 26, and once when I was 40. I wanted to come back before I died, and I wanted you to come with me." Daniel nodded. He didn't trust his voice, They went over together. The water was cold, even through the wetsuit, but it was also the clearest water Daniel had ever seen. Visibility was extraordinary, 50 feet, maybe more. They descended along the anchor line, equalizing pressure as they went, and Daniel watched the surface grow distant above them, a rippling silver ceiling that slowly faded to blue. His father was beside him, descending more slowly, his movements careful but determined. Daniel stayed close. He wouldn't let the old man out of his sight. At 40 feet, Daniel began to see something below them. At first, he thought it was just the ocean floor, a sandy bottom, maybe some rocks. But as they descended further, he realized that the shapes were too regular, too structured. There were lines where there shouldn't be lines, angles where nature would have made curves. At 60 feet, he understood. It was a ship, a wooden ship, ancient and massive, lying on her side in the sand. Her hull was encrusted with sea life, anemones and coral and things Daniel couldn't name. But her bones were still visible beneath the growth. She was old, centuries old, the kind of ship that belonged in museums, in history books, in the stories that sailors told in harbor bars when they'd had too much to drink. Daniel's heart was pounding so hard he could feel it in his temples. He looked at his father, saw the old man floating beside the wreck with his hand outstretched, touching the ancient wood with a gentleness that Daniel had rarely seen in him. They swam along the hull, moving slowly, carefully. The ship was perhaps 100 feet long, her masts long gone, her deck collapsed into her hold. But she was remarkably intact for her age, preserved somehow in this cold, still water. Daniel saw cannons, actual cannons, half buried in the sand beside her. He saw chains and anchors in shapes that might have been cargo crates, all encrusted and transformed by time. And then his father pointed. There, in what had once been the captain's cabin, was a hole in the hull. It was dark inside, but Daniel could see something glinting in the shadows, something that caught the faint light filtering down from above and threw it back in a way that made his breath catch. His father gestured. "Follow me." They swam through the hole into the cabin. It was cramped and dark, the water thick with particles, but Jonas produced a dive light from his belt and switched it on. The beam cut through the murk and landed on something that made Daniel's mind go blank. Chests, wooden chests, stacked against the far wall of the cabin, their lids open or broken, their contents spilling out into the water. Gold coins scattered across the floor like fallen leaves. Silver bars stacked in corroded piles. Jewels, actual jewels, emeralds and rubies and things Daniel didn't have names for, glinting in the light like frozen fire. It was a treasure, an actual, genuine, impossible treasure, lying forgotten at the bottom of the ocean for God knew how many centuries. Daniel hung motionless in the water, his mind refusing to process what his eyes were seeing. He had heard stories of shipwrecks like this. Everyone who grew up on the water heard stories, but they were always just that, stories, legends, things that happened to other people, in other times, in other places. Not here, not now, not to him. He turned to look at his father. Jonas was floating beside him, the dive light held steady, watching Daniel's face with an expression of quiet satisfaction. And in that moment, Daniel understood something that he had never understood before. His father had known about this for 40 years, had kept it secret for 4 decades, never touching it, never telling anyone, never using it to change his life or escape the hard, grinding work of fishing. Jonas Whitmore could have been rich, could have been famous, could have been anything other than what he was. An aging fisherman on a dying island, working a dying trade, living a life that his own son had fled from as fast as he could. Why? The question screamed in Daniel's mind. Why would anyone walk away from this? They stayed down for another 10 minutes, exploring the wreck, taking nothing. When their air began to run low, Jonas signaled, and they ascended slowly, carefully, following all the protocols that Jonas had drilled into Daniel decades ago. They broke the surface into the gray October light, and Daniel tore off his mask and gasped for air that felt too thin after what he had just seen. They climbed back onto the Northern Grace in silence. Daniel helped his father out of his gear, saw how exhausted the old man was, how much the dive had cost him. Jonas sat down heavily on the deck, his back against the gunwale, his face the color of old paper. But he was smiling, a small, tired smile that Daniel had never seen before. "Now you know," Jonas said. Daniel sat down across from him. His hands were shaking. "How long?" he managed. "How long have you known about this?" "Found it when I was 26. Diving alone. Stupid thing to do. But I was young and didn't know better. Got caught in a current, dragged way off course. When I finally got my bearings, I was right above her." Jonas shook his head slowly. "Thought I was hallucinating. Thought I'd breathed bad air or hit my head or something. Went back the next day to make sure I wasn't crazy. And there she was." "And you never told anyone?" "Never." Daniel stared at his father. The treasure in that wreck was worth, what, millions? Tens of millions? More? The historical value alone would be incalculable. The gold, the silver, the jewels. It would change everything. It would change his father's life, his mother's life, Daniel's life. It would change the island. And Jonas had sat on it for 40 years, going out every morning to haul nets and traps, coming home every night smelling of fish and diesel, living in the same small house and wearing the same worn clothes and never once letting on that there was another option. "Why?" Daniel asked. "Dad, why?" Jonas looked out at the water. The gray sky reflected off its surface like a mirror, and for a moment, father and son seemed to be floating in an endless gray void, suspended between heaven and earth. "When I first found it," Jonas said slowly, "I thought the same thing you're thinking now. This is it. This is my way out. I'll bring it up, sell it, get rich, buy a big boat, move somewhere warm, never haul another net as long as I live." He paused. "I even started making plans, figuring out how to do it without anyone knowing, how to move it, where to sell it, how to explain where the money came from." He coughed, a wet, rattling sound that made Daniel wince. "But then your mother told me she was pregnant, with you." Daniel felt something twist in his chest. "And I started thinking about what kind of man I wanted to be, what kind of father." Jonas met his son's eyes. "See, there's a thing about treasure, Danny. It doesn't make you into something new. It just makes you more of what you already are. If you're greedy, it makes you greedier. If you're generous, it makes you more generous. And if you're weak—" He shook his head. "I knew myself well enough to know that I wasn't ready, that I'd take that money and lose myself in it, that I'd become someone your mother wouldn't recognize, someone you wouldn't respect. So you just left it there." "I left it there." Jonas smiled his tired smile. "And I went back to fishing, and I raised you, and I tried to become the kind of man who could deserve something like that. 40 years, Danny. 40 years of trying to be worthy of what's down there." Daniel didn't know what to say. He had spent so much of his life resenting his father, resenting the long hours, The missed dinners, the emotional distance, the feeling that the sea always came first. But now, sitting on the deck of the Northern Grace with the knowledge of that treasure burning in his mind, he saw his father differently. He saw a man who had faced the biggest temptation of his life and walked away from it. A man who had chosen a harder path because he believed it would make him better. A man who had, in his own silent way, been teaching his son something valuable all along. "Why tell me now?" Daniel asked quietly. Jonas was silent for a long moment. "Because I'm dying," he said finally, "and because you came home. When your mother called you about the cancer, I figured you'd come for a week, maybe 2. Pay your respects, make peace, then go back to your real life. But you stayed. 3 months now, and you're still here." He looked at Daniel with something like wonder in his eyes. "You could have left. You had every reason to. But you stayed. I didn't know about the treasure." "Exactly." Jonas reached out and gripped Daniel's shoulder, a rare gesture, so unexpected that Daniel almost flinched. "You stayed because you wanted to. Because this place means something to you after all. Because maybe, just maybe, you're finally ready to understand what I've been trying to teach you all these years." Daniel felt tears pricking at his eyes. He blinked them back. "What's that?" "That the treasure isn't down there." Jonas pointed at the water. "It's up here." He moved his hand to Daniel's chest, over his heart. "It's who you become in the trying. It's the mornings you get up early even when you're tired. It's the nets you haul even when they come up empty. It's staying when everyone else is telling you to leave." His voice cracked slightly. "It's coming home to your dying father, even though you could have stayed in your fancy office making money." Daniel couldn't hold the tears back anymore. They ran down his face, mixing with the salt spray, and he didn't bother to wipe them away. "Dad, I'm not going to tell you what to do with it," Jonas said. "The treasure. When I'm gone, it's yours to decide. Bring it up, leave it down, do whatever you think is right. But promise me something." "Anything. Promise me you'll think about it. Really think. Not about the money, but about the man you want to be. The life you want to live." Jonas's grip tightened on his shoulder. "Promise me you'll let it teach you something before you decide." Daniel nodded. "I promise." They sat there for a long time, father and son, on the gently rolling deck of the Northern Grace, above the treasure that had waited 40 years to be revealed. The gray sky slowly began to brighten in the west, a thin line of gold appearing on the horizon, like a secret promise. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of salt and distance and possibility, and somewhere far below them, in the cold, dark water, the ancient ship kept her centuries-old vigil, patient as stone, waiting to see what these men would do. "Dad?" Daniel said finally. "Yeah. Thank you. For showing me." Jonas smiled. It was the warmest smile Daniel had ever seen on his father's face. A smile without walls, without reserve, without any of the emotional armor they had both worn for so many years. "Thank you for being worth showing." They started the engine and headed home. The island appeared on the horizon, small at first, then growing larger, its familiar shape welcoming them back. Daniel stood at the wheel, his father beside him, and for the first time in as long as he could remember, he wasn't thinking about leaving. He wasn't thinking about the life he had lost or the life he had left behind. He was thinking about what his father had said, about who he wanted to be, about what kind of man was worth becoming. The treasure would still be there tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. It had waited 40 years. It could wait a little longer. But time with his father couldn't wait. That was the only treasure that was truly running out. Daniel adjusted course toward the harbor, toward home, toward whatever came next. And beside him, Jonas. Whitmore closed his eyes and let the wind wash over his face, and smiled the smile of a man who had finally passed on the most important thing he had to give. Not gold, not silver, not jewels, just a lesson, wrapped in a map about what really matters. And sometimes that's worth more than all the treasure in the world.